Today, we're going to cover some of the caving and cave diving disasters that we have covered on this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Lance Taysom is a caver and climber who won an award from the International Technical Rescue Symposium in 2017. Around 15 years prior, he led a group, including his friend and their 2 boys, on a caving trip to Crystal Ice Cave. The group expertly scouted their trip ahead of time, but despite all their planning and expertise, they found themselves trapped in a frozen cave deep below ground. This is the story of how his own son risked everything to find a way to save them all from the frozen grip of Crystal Ice Cave. Before we dive into the video, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to our channel. Currently, only 8% of our viewers are subscribed, but your subscription helps us create more content like this. Simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. By doing so, you'll also help YouTube recommend our content to a wider audience. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. On a snowy morning in May, Lance Taysom, his friend, and their 2 sons, ages 8 and 13, drove around 22 miles northwest of American Falls, Idaho, to the Crystal Ice Cave. Along the way, they passed through a park called the Craters of the Moon, a region named for large, barren mountains that descend onto empty fields covered in the remains of volcanic eruptions like misshapen cinder cones and glassy obsidian. Some regions of the park are covered in blackened rock stretching out as far as the eye can see, creating an alien landscape resembling the surface of the moon. In other sections of the park, small shrubs dot the landscape, and in the distance, craters of red and black rock dig into the earth with walking trails on their rims. Along their borders, the sagebrush starts to dominate the land, and even some tough pioneering trees have wrestled for their spot in the harsh environment of the park. Normally, the ground by the cave was covered in miles of sagebrush and little shrubs. Their dry twigs and rough fibers should have been visible poking up through the snow. But the ground was oddly flat as the cavers approached. All of the shrubs were gone. It made for an eerie sight as they gazed out on the empty field of snow. At 10 a.m., the group began rigging a rope at a hole in the ground. This hole was scheduled to be their exit and the hardest climb of the cave. The group carefully crouched down in the snow and looked down this skylight into the chamber below. With the sun shining through the chasm, they could see the rope to check that it was safely resting on the ground, which took all the guesswork out of rigging the proper length. Taysom had been to the Crystal Ice Cave many times before, so he knew the chamber below was covered in snow that floated down through the skylight. In previous trips, the snow was only around 2 feet deep inside the cave. Snow on the cave floor was normal, and it even had some benefit since the weight of boots easily compressed it, adding a few extra inches of height, which made it easier to start the climb out of the skylight. He used a 200-foot rope and verified that multiple coils were lying flat on the ground so that they had some extra leeway just in case. Outside, on their way to the main entrance to finish preparations, they walked past the remains of lava rock that had turned to rusty orange hues from exposure to the air and sunlight. They planned to enter through a large, collapsed pit with a small hole near one side. The cave had a second entrance, but that region was supposed to be blocked, and it was mostly horizontal in length, so it was less sporty than rappelling down the chasm in the wintry winds. The 3 cavers were well dressed for their outing. Taysom also did mountaineering in the winter, so their gear could handle the cold weather both above and below ground. Their thick gloves were designed to insulate while also providing enough grip to hang on to their ropes. They had a mixture of safety features at their disposal, like harnesses, lights, extra food, water, and all the training in the world. In the barren landscape above the rift, the group had to get creative with their anchors. Once the ropes were secured, they began their descent. The wind was furious, causing the rope to sway as snow blew onto their faces and eyes from above. Taysom and his friend showed the boys how to manage the onslaught of snow and wind. Little did they know, just 11 years before their outing, 19-year-old Evan L. Bates slipped off the edge of the nearby Kings Bowl and fell 100 feet to his death. The icy conditions they experienced could easily cause anyone from this group to meet the same fate, but they descended into the bottom of the 42-foot rift without much issue. Wasting no time, they flicked their lights on and breached the entrance of the cave. The entrance rift and the crystal ice cave itself are both some of the many karst structures that have been formed by the Great Rift located along the 400-mile-long Snake River Plain, which connects to Yellowstone in the east. The sealed horizontal entrance met with a trail carved into the splintered rock by a mining engineer who spent his life developing the cave into an attraction for visitors, blasting through the basalt rock to create a safer, artificial entrance spanning a quarter-mile-long tunnel. That was back in the 1960s, but safety inspectors closed the cave roughly 20 years later. Today, the cave has fallen into disrepair, making it a destination for both cavers and explorers who like to catalog the dilapidated remains of old abandoned buildings, ghastly theme parks, and other urbanized structures that are actively being reclaimed by nature. The route they took into Crystal Ice Cave opened into a passage with ceilings high enough for comfortable walking. After a short distance, the group reached the first abandoned viewing room, where tourists used to safely view glamorous ice structures through glass panes that protected the delicate structures from prying hands. Today, the glass is dark and cracked, the paint along the wooden frames has peeled away, and the structures behind the glass have seemingly vanished, leaving only a black void. Taysom's group passed by a line of rusted anchors along the opposite wall, which may have been the remainders of a safety haul line to quickly rescue injured tourists. Or it may have been used to string up emergency rope lights or lanterns. The group crunched broken glass, which cut through the rubber soles of their shoes, but not enough to pierce all the way through. They continued to watch for any nails, since cuts would expose their skin and blood to the practically sub-zero temperatures of the cave. The route they planned through Crystal Ice Cave lacked any difficult crawls, so they could probably avoid bacteria or debris from infecting a wound. But if a hand or foot got injured, it could be almost impossible to complete the cave's numerous climbs. They had to keep their eyes out for many other hazards you wouldn't expect to find below ground as they trekked through the haunting interior of a cave that was part natural and part excavation, part beauty and part horror. For decades, glass window panes, metal support structures, and other pieces of infrastructure were left to slowly wither away. Renewal projects have tried to cover up evidence of the cave's commercial past by removing some debris, changing trails and roads, and removing railings to make the cave look more natural, but this work was never finished. All hopes of returning the cave to its natural state have been destroyed, just like the miner's dream that made the cave popular to begin with. The group marveled at Crystal Ice Cave's triangular rooms, which looked like they could be artificial, but they were made when segments of the ground were pushed upward from the force of magma, creating a pressure ridge-type cave. The unique shape of these tunnels enabled wind to chill water in the cave, forming the ice structures that attracted so many visitors to this spot. However, as the group stepped through a broken window structure, the cavers found the tragic state of Crystal Ice Cave. What was once one of the cave's largest, most spectacular formations was reduced to a frozen puddle with only a few small ice stalagmites remaining. Chemicals from the mining work, vandals, effects of global warming, and mold all worked against the delicate balance of the cave. The mold or fungi that infected the cave also burrowed into rock to form microscopic cave-like structures, consuming it and weakening the structure of the cave. Multiple breakdowns have happened over the years, spurred by the loss of supporting ice and the destructive power of the fungal infestation present within the cave's cramped quarters. any step could be their last if a cliff were to break before they attached their belay, or if a cave-in crushed or trapped them. Near the desolate spot where tall ice floes once stood, a few larger ice mounds remained below the massive ceiling. The kids had the primal urge to break the icicles off the walls and stomp on the icy spikes on the ground, but the adults reminded them to respect the cave so future generations could enjoy it too. Carefully stepping around the corner, they found another passage tucked away amidst more rubble that sat precariously close to another ledge. They had reached the second climb of Crystal Ice Cave. This time, for the larger 50-foot drop, they rigged a different knot and rappelled into the cave's most stunning descent. Along the wall, ice and rock mixed together to form layers with large, rounded ice rungs and brown, dusty stone. On the ledge up top, water from the ceiling formed a thin layer of black ice that looked nearly invisible in their torchlight, so they had to anchor their rope further back to avoid crashing to the ground below. The icy wall was difficult to manage for some of them. They hadn't brought ice climbing shoes, so they experienced some slips as they tried to create friction against the smooth surface to control their descent. Still, despite the dangers, they conquered this section and found themselves at the bottom of a large rift covered in boulders that had broken off of the walls and ceiling. Taysom and the others used a pull-down rig for this rope. That way, they could take the rope with them once they finished the second climb. Once they completed the cave, they could retrace their steps on the surface to grab the other two ropes. They only had a short distance left to go, so they pulled the rope through the loops up above and moved across the breakdown to the entrance of the 150-foot-tall skylight room, their designated exit. Normally, some faint glows can be seen through the hole past the breakdown as sunlight from the sinkhole beyond filters through the cave. It would be a welcome sight compared to the suffocating darkness of the cave. Taysom and his friend were looking forward to seeing their boys' reactions to the light. But as they got closer, they started to get concerned. This time, as they hiked up the mound of rocks and dirt at the end of the breakdown room, no faintly glowing light was there to beckon their arrival. Earlier, when they rigged the drop, they could see the bottom of the cave, so they knew the skylight should be visible. Why was there only darkness ahead? The skylight was near a hill at the end of the breakdown room, a dense mound that had been formed by sediment drifting into the cave, compacted by water and even more dirt, and hardened into a cement-like formation. As Taysom and his group reached the hill, they were shocked to find that the passage was blocked, filled with almost 20 feet of snow that had compacted to form a thick, impenetrable wall. The group carefully examined the blockage and found footprints in the snow that led up the mound and seemed to disappear under the ceiling. Taysom grabbed a sharp rock and an ice screw and hammered away at the snow plume. Slowly, he formed a small foothold to create a safe pathway up the hill where it met the ceiling. They all hoped that there was a small crack near the top that they could crawl or dig their way through to reach the skylight and exit the cave, but no luck. Something must have changed in the cave since the last time someone was here. There was only supposed to be a few feet of snow in the cave, and it shouldn't even reach this far down. They suppressed creeping sensations of dread as they searched around the room for any signs that could help them through this barrier. They already knew they were trapped, but the dangers hadn't sunk in yet. They couldn't backtrack since they'd already pulled the rope through the second pitch. The large, rounded ice shelves of the pitch would be impossible to climb without ropes. Even if they had ice climbing equipment like picks and spiked shoes that could grip the ice, they would need to perform bouldering maneuvers that not even pros would attempt without a belay, dangling off the ledges with no footholds as they tried to climb over them. The team made fast work of the cave, so they still had hours left before their time limit was up. At that point, relatives back home would report them overdue. A rescue would ensue, and it would be easy for rescuers to reach them since the entry rope was already rigged and they were on the main path. All they needed was a rope to be lowered down the second pitch. They had plenty of food and water, but the temperatures in the cave were incredibly cold. The men could handle the cold just fine, but the boys would be at risk. It was up to them to get out of the cave or risk dying slow, painful deaths in the frigid cold. If no rescue came, or if conditions worsened inside, the men would undoubtedly give their sons extra warmth, and the boys would have to sit idly by as their parents wilted away, curled up and frozen solid. After brushing away part of the snow from the wall, they were excited to find a 5-inch space that had formed between the hard-packed snow and the wall. The gap seemed to go all the way through to the skylight room. How had the gap formed? The boys didn't trust it. It seemed impossible at first, since temperatures were cold enough to prevent the snow from melting, but the faint sunlight and wind through the skylight could have made the snow turn directly into gas without melting in a process called sublimation. Luckily for them, this crack next to the wall bypassed the dense mound of rocks which should have been in the center of the snow wall. The group felt they had only one choice. They all grabbed what they could and worked to enlarge the space. Using primitive rocks and anything they could find in their gear packs, they chipped away at the dense mound of snow and ice. When the passage was just large enough for him, 8-year-old Jesse Taysom volunteered to crawl through the gap. Crawling through this crack would be incredibly risky. If any pieces of ice or rock broke off and tumbled downhill toward the crack, they could crush him, breaking bones, rendering him unconscious, or killing him instantly. The snow had hardened, but if there was any lighter snow beyond their vision, it could also quickly rush into the space, sealing the passage shut and burying him alive while his father looked on helplessly. If a nightmare scenario happened, even trying to dig Jesse out could cause more catastrophe, as the mold-worn cave walls themselves could crumble with all the impact of digging and thrashing into the snow and rubble, crushing or sealing them all inside the cave. In spite of all the dangers, it was up to Jesse to save them. They were all tense as Jesse began his crawl through the tightly packed snow. Wedged against the freezing rock, he felt the cold compress his warm clothing, chilling him to his core. The volcanic metal along the wall threatened to scrape his skin as he contorted through the difficult space. As he wormed his way forward, chunks of icy snow and powdered shavings fell in front of him. He scooped the pieces up and pushed them down to his torso until he could kick the rubble backward to continue crawling. Miraculously, after around 3 feet of crawling in tightly packed snow, the space enlarged to nearly 2 feet in width. Jesse now had enough space to comfortably traverse the rest of the gap to see where it went. He was within earshot still, so he shouted back his discovery. The rest of the team was excited to hear the development, though any loud talking could cause the whole mound to collapse in an underground avalanche. After another 20 feet of crawling, Jesse could see sunlight in the room beyond. They were almost home free. But what was supposed to happen when he reached the other side? Would 8-year-old Jesse have to climb up the 150-foot exit rope by himself? And even if he could, what would they do then? Would he have to traverse the barren wilderness of craters of the moon alone in the blistering wind just to get to civilization and call for help? Would he have to backtrack through the crawl again to grab the rope, complete the first half of the cave, and then rig the second climb by himself? He didn't have time to consider all the possibilities as his easy crawling came to an end. The passage ahead narrowed once more. To get through, he had to dig through the snow all by himself, shoveling it back into and filling up the wider crack. He had limited tools and almost no space to work with. To make matters worse, he didn't have the strength of an adult caver, so each strike with his tools, each grasp with his hands barely made a dent in the wall ahead. As he pushed through, Jesse found himself once again trapped in an icebox. The cold snow made each movement difficult, and the way backward was now layered with ice chunks and shavings. Slowly, after using most of his energy, he persevered and exited the crack. Once on the other side, he found the rope intact at the base of the skylight. The path through the sinkhole was still able to be climbed. Proving it was possible to traverse this gap, Jesse began digging through the tunnel in the opposite direction, grabbing the rubble from his first trip and pushing it out into the skylight room. Eventually, he returned to the group and informed them that they could make it through this narrow crack. With their call-out time fast approaching, the rest of the team worked to enlarge the crack, hammering away at the snow and ice with stones and whatever metal they had on hand in their supply kits. After they widened the first narrow section, they took turns digging through the next layer on their sides, forming a chain between the wall and the mound. After what felt like an eternity in Crystal Ice Cave, the group worked together to widen the last passage enough to enter the skylight room. All thanks to Jesse's scouting effort. It turns out, a wildfire had ravaged the area a year prior to their adventure, destroying all of the sagebrush that normally covered the ground. Without the protection of the shrubs, the wind had no barriers to slow it down. Wind speed increased across the field, blowing snow from the ground into the skylight toward the breakdown chamber below. As layers of snow continued to enter the cave, more and more snow flowed into the mouth of the skylight room. Increased wind chill made the effective temperature lower, which caused the snow to solidify on the cave floor. When Taysom and the other cavers looked down the skylight earlier, they couldn't tell the difference between the normal 2-foot snow coverage they had expected and the massive 10 or so feet of snow that actually blanketed the ground. As they all entered the room, they saw another passage beyond that easily floods. This time, it was covered in ice. Using the last energy they had, Taysom, Jesse, and the others made it out of Crystal Ice Cave, rattled but unharmed. They later learned that another group of cavers experienced the same trap just a few weeks before. Luckily, they had a whistle, and they left one caver above ground. The above-ground member heard the whistle and quickly got them to safety. Ever since those close calls back in the early 2000s, cavers have been advised to check the skylight entrance before removing any ropes from the first or second pitch, or else risk becoming trapped below ground in the freezing snow and ice. As the warmth of summer faded in August of 2007, a group of professional cavers tried to tackle all 8 miles of Fitton Cave in the state of Arkansas. The cave's grueling challenges took their toll on the cavers as frigid air tightened their lungs. That day, Fitton Cave nearly claimed the life of 63-year-old Bill France after he tried a risky maneuver without ropes. His team scrambled to save him, and their efforts became the gold standard for cavers all over the world. See how his team beat the rescuers at their own job as we explore the story of Fitton Cave's incredible rescue. Fitton Cave is one of the largest underground systems in the state of Arkansas. It lies beneath the Buffalo National River Park, along with over 300 sister caves beneath the Ozark Plateau. Fitton is closed to the public because of the widespread and deadly white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is a fungal infection that grows on bats while they're hibernating. As it grows, it eats holes in the bat's wings, nose, and ears. The damage caused by the fungus wakes the bats from their hibernation, causing them to move and expand extra energy until they eventually die. Cavers can accidentally spread microscopic fungal spores into the caves, where they can populate and decimate the bat population inside. Professional speleologists who know how to check for signs of the fungus can still access the cave via a permit from the geologists stationed at the Buffalo River Park. So far, over 8 miles of underground tunnels have been mapped in Fitton. though cavers believe more passages could be unearthed. On that day, 8 cavers ventured into Fitton to map new details, check on the health of the cave's ecosystem, and test their mettle against the cave's dangerous challenges. They started their journey in the beauty entrance because it's the easier main entrance to the cave. The second entrance is closed for roughly half the year starting August 15th because of seasonal rains. This group was only 2 weeks away from the rainy season when they entered. They were dangerously close to flooding and sudden disaster below ground. They descended down mostly vertical and steep passages to the roundhouse room, and from there, they entered the crystal room before climbing up to the tea room. It sounds like a simple trek, but reaching the tea room was a monumental task. While the total length of the cave is only 1/3 the length of a marathon, it takes almost twice as long to complete. By this point, the team had been exploring for nearly 8 hours deep underground. Remember, these aren't your friendly vacation caves. These cavers had been ducking, crawling, climbing, and putting their whole bodies through intense physical strain for a full workday. The ages of the group ranged from 22 to 63, so while some members were at peak condition, others were starting to feel the strain. They pushed through their fatigue and reached the next room. This area is called the 21 Jumps. Multiple rivers all converged in this room, creating a tiered cavern with multiple levels and deep gaps separating some of the sections. Active waterways surged through the channels as the cavers entered the room. To cross through the area safely, cavers could climb down some of the cliffs to lower levels and then up the sides of a different spire to bypass the rivers. Other cavers chose the faster, more athletic route, where explorers must climb above the water to a higher level and then jump from one section to the next. The so-called jumps aren't too far apart. Some just require a single step to cross, and others just require cavers to stretch their legs from one ledge to the next. Literally jumping in caves is usually forbidden because it's inherently risky. If humidity gets too saturated, the small ledges can get slippery, and the sudden weight of a person landing on the rock could cause it to break free. This section is even more dangerous once you learn that cavers traverse the 21 jumps without ropes. Bill France was the eldest member of the party at 63 years old. He wasn't leading the pack, but he was managing his way through Fitton without much hassle. Bill went to cross one of the ledges when tragedy struck. He wasn't sure what happened, and none of the other cavers saw it either. Somehow, he tumbled backward. He reached forward, but his hands couldn't find anything to grip in the narrow void. Bill saw only darkness rush past him as he fell 6 feet down. His body instinctively leaned to mitigate the fall, but then he tried to extend his back. Maybe he was trying to wedge himself in the crack to prevent falling, but instead, he cracked his head and back against the stone. The impact sent him rolling another 6 feet down. Bill was still conscious when he finally hit the floor of the room, but he wasn't himself. The pain of the impact had sent his body into panic mode, and for some strange reason, he couldn't feel the ground. He didn't know he had landed. The chilly earthen floor of the cave felt like air, or maybe like nothing at all. Bill was on the floor of Fitton Cave, flailing his arms and legs as if he was still in free fall. His hands banged against the stone, and he cried out frantic groans as he rolled around. The splunking team heard the fall and looked down to see that Bill was moving erratically, and as he thrashed, he was inching closer and closer to the edge. Fellow caver Will Heltsley quickly shimmied down one of the cracks to Bill's aid. Once he got to his side, he was able to grab Bill and talk to him. Bill's wide eyes met Will's, and Will was able to calm Bill down enough to stop him from pushing himself closer to yet another fall. Bill's mind slowly started to catch up to what was happening as his pain overcame his fear. Will acted fast. He gently eased Bill into a neutral position and stabilized his head and neck. Then, he grabbed some materials like excess clothing and his own backpack. He rolled up some softer materials and placed them under Bill's neck for support, and then placed larger materials next to his head to prevent him from accidentally moving his head and neck. Bill was struggling to feel in the moments after the fall, which was a bad sign. Even though he could feel pain now, his friends had to check for serious injury. Will and the rest of the team immediately recognized that Bill might have damaged his spine from the fall. Any further moves could worsen his injuries, so thankfully, they knew how to create a temporary splint for Bill's neck and head. Lucky for Bill, he had 7 other cavers with him. Usually, caving groups consist of only a few people, so if someone gets injured, the other cavers might not be strong enough to save them. With their combined might, they were able to delicately lift Bill while keeping his head and neck stable. Once he was raised just a few inches from the ground, they were able to remove his backpack. Bill realized he had another injury as the team lifted him off the ground. The sudden pressure and pulling on his limbs sent shock waves of pain jolting from his shoulder down to his hands and up into his core. His hands became hot with pressure and blood as they slowly brought him down. But to get Bill into a comfortable position, they would have to move him more and subject him to more pain. They heaved him off the ground again to slide the camera strap and film pouch off his torso. Then they unhooked the clasps of his helmet to check for injuries. Removing his helmet would also let his head rest flatter on their makeshift splint. Then his fellow cavers performed a log roll. One member held Bill's head to keep it straight, while other members overlapped their arms on Bill's side with their knees against his other side. Together, they all pulled at once, while the members at the other end kept Bill's legs straight to prevent his spine from twisting. From this position, Bill could rest without pressure on his bad shoulder. At this point, some of the cavers were discussing who would leave to call for help, but no one was leaving until they knew Bill was stable. Supporting members of the team dug into Bill's caving pack, and others reached into their own packs. They pulled out an insulating blanket and draped it over him. They also took out heat packs and laid them under the blanket to provide warmth. Bill's fellow cavers were top-of-the-line pros. They knew they needed to do injury and orientation checks to get a general idea about what Bill was experiencing. The results of these tests would give rescuers crucial information to expedite the extraction process, saving rescuers time and getting Bill out faster by ensuring they brought the exact tools needed for the job. Bill was in luck yet again. All checks came back clear. The fall had screwed with his perception for a few moments, but now he only had a sensitive area where his head hit the stone wall, bruised ribs from landing on the floor, and a dislocated collarbone. While painful, these injuries were nothing compared to what could have happened. Bill narrowly avoided disaster. The team allowed him to sit up so that he could drink water and let his nerves calm down. With Bill stabilized, 5 members of the team left the cave through a different exit. They chose to depart through the wet entrance, which snaked through the cold rivers and a waterfall above this room. The deadly water of this entrance is the reason part of the cave is closed for half the year. They went up the wet entrance because this route was only a little over a quarter mile away versus the 7-hour trek back the way they came. It seemed like an obvious choice if they wanted to prioritize Bill's safety, but this decision was risky. On the one hand, the team could get to the surface and call for help faster, but on the other hand, 3 members of this group left their extra warming gear behind with Bill. This route was significantly colder than their planned exit route, so the combination of fast-moving water and extreme cold could easily lead to more accidents. The team fought their way up the frothing waters as they battled for grip along the smooth stone surfaces of Fitton Cave. The 3 cavers who had removed some of their layers dug deep as their bodies began to go numb from the cold. Meanwhile, Jonah Shackner and John Tinsley remained by Bill's side to monitor his condition. The 2 grabbed a notebook and began logging Bill's vital signs. These notes could alert them of any changes in Bill's condition. If his pulse was gradually changing, or if his respiratory rate suddenly spiked, they could immediately prepare other first aid techniques to delay his condition from getting worse. Those logs would also be useful for paramedics when extracting Bill from the cave. Bill's arm was still in severe pain from his dislocated clavicle. The collarbone, or clavicle, could be dislocated on either side. One side attaches to the sternum, or breastplate between the ribcage, and the other attaches to the AC joint. Since the pain radiated from his shoulder, the team of professional cavers concluded that Bill's collarbone was likely dislocated at the AC joint. Jonah and John realized they could use clothing to create a sling that pinned Bill's arm to his chest to prevent it from moving, while also keeping it in a natural position to prevent further injury. Up above, the team of 5 cavers exited Fitton and called for rescue. They reached Chuck Bidding, who worked as the Buffalo National River Park's cave specialist. Bidding dispatched his own search and rescue team that staffed trained cavers and emergency paramedics. He also contacted local emergency crews at the nearby town of Harrison. Harrison's own firefighters, ambulance, and police rallied to Fitton for the rescue. The local Arkansas Caving Club, the Middle Ozark Lower Earth Society, or MOLS, also sent some volunteers to help save Bill from the crushing darkness of Fitton Cave. Back at the wet entrance, the three members with lighter gear stayed outside to wait for rescuers, while Will Heltsley and Matt Covington re-entered the cave after eating a short meal. They also borrowed gear from the other cavers since they were going back through the dangerous wet entrance again, and with less support. Despite being cold and tired, Matt and Will pushed their bodies to the limit and overcame the waters of Fitton. Once they reached Bill, the group reflected on what could have happened. They were all worn down by the cave prior to the accident. 7.5 hours in a grueling, cold, cramped cave is enough to break even the strongest people. There could have been mud on the ledge, but regardless of what it was that made Bill slip, he was lucky he didn't roll into the rivers or fall into a deeper crack or pinball his way down the twisting vertical chambers of the cave. Rescue teams arrived and debated on how and where they would enter the cave. The wet entrance was close, but it was also dangerous. Rescuers should rig ropes through difficult water sections for their own safety and for the person being rescued. This would take significant time since there weren't adequate anchors in place already. Rescuers would have to stand in the wet tunnels while they worked on rigging lines, which would make the work harder, and the extreme cold would force cavers to rotate members more frequently. They'd be wearing themselves down while Bill was suffering deep underground. The first responders decided to rig some lines through the waterfalls and charge through the wet entrance to Fitton. Inside the cave, Bill and his fellow cavers decided on a self-rescue. Bill was given the green light to stand up on his own and make the trip out of the cave with the help of 4 of his fellow cavers. They had no idea the rescue team was coming, but they also chose to rig ropes as they progressed to keep Bill safe. They would need to keep close tabs on Bill since he was only able to use one arm. Bill connected his harness once more, and then his teammates connected ropes from his harness to their own. That way, if Bill slipped again, they could prevent him from sliding away down the subterranean rivers. They also helped him by providing support and even holding him through challenging sections. It's likely that one of the cavers stayed a dozen or so feet behind the main group as a last line of defense in case more disaster struck. The team battled through rivers that went up to their chest as the chilly waters sapped the warmth from their veins. They also had to overcome 4 small climbing sections. Bill used all his strength in his good arm to move up the sides of the cave without rubbing his damaged arm and torso against the rock. With the added safety measures in place, Bill conquered these climbs. Shortly afterward, the team escorting Bill met the first call-out team, the first rescuers who were slowly making their way to them as they rigged lines. These rescuers double-checked the vital logs and reassessed Bill's condition for safety. Bill was clearly doing well, so the rescuers joined with the caving group and kept an eye on the team in case anything went wrong. Somehow, Bill pulled through a crawl with just one arm, even as the tight space pressed against his injured collarbone. The final challenge was the long climb to the exit. Thankfully, the first call-out team had already rigged this section. With painkillers administered and his spirits returning, Bill and the rest of the crew exited Fitton Cave at 5 a.m. the next day. Bill hiked back to his camp to gather his things before departing to the hospital. It turns out Bill's team contained members of the National Cave Rescue Commission, so they were able to execute a nearly flawless rescue on their own. Bill's miraculous story is a stark contrast compared to the way novices handle caving accidents. The team's quick thinking and medical knowledge saved Bill's life, which bolstered his indomitable spirit. The team of cavers became their own rescuers, giving Bill the courage to exit Fitton Cave on his own 2 legs in spite of his injury. Thanks for watching. Bill's caving buddies were experts, but statistics show the vast majority of caving fatalities are from inexperienced or unlicensed cavers. Blowing Cave near Cushman, Arkansas is famous for its strange history and the rescues undertaken in its dark depths. Stories say that for hundreds of years, people exploring the cave have vanished without a trace. These tales were dismissed as superstition until the late summer of 2016. That year, 2 Japanese exchange students and 1 local college senior went missing during a casual trip into Blowing Cave. Rescuers struggled for hours to locate the cavers who seemingly disappeared in the cold, rocky tunnels. Did Blowing Cave claim another group of cavers, or would rescuers reach them in time? Find out as we explore the mystery of Blowing Cave. Not to be confused with Limrock Blowing Cave in Alabama, the Blowing Cave in Arkansas is a well-mapped, moderately sized cave that extends for 1.43 miles underground. Blowing Cave's strange backstory has attracted plenty of first-time cavers and newbies over the years, but it's deceptively challenging. The cave was closed to the public for many years to prevent people from getting injured or dying in its claustrophobic tunnels. As soon as new landowner Jim Miller took over the property, he opened the cave to visitors by reservation only, with Sunday afternoons open to the public. A sign in the woods warns people that the owner isn't responsible for injury in the cave, but there's a strange detail near the bottom. The owner isn't responsible for abduction by aliens or ghosts. At first glance, it sounds like a joke. A lighthearted aside to undercut the seriousness of the warning, but there's more to it than that. These superstitions made Blowing Cave infamous for a time, and they're connected to a tragic, true story. In the late 1800s, the cave was supposedly used as a community center for parties and dances. Over time, tipsy celebrateurs from the newly formed town of Cushman supposedly ventured deep into Blowing Cave and vanished without a trace. A century later, and rumors started, claiming Blowing Cave was harboring mysterious blue entities inside its hollow caverns. These stories attracted hundreds, if not thousands, of conspiracy theorists to the cave over the years. No doubt, many cavers found their new hobby thanks to visiting Blowing Cave in search of these blue creatures. It turns out, the famous blue person myth of Blowing Cave was all a story written by Richard Shaver. Dubbed the Shaver Mystery, this story ranted about robot-like creatures that tormented people's minds from their underground cities. Some people bought Shaver's tall tales, but even in the days before the internet, many readers thought that Shaver's story was like a written version of the Blair Witch Project, a fake story that claims to be real. But as time went on, people realized Shaver wasn't marketing his story for fans. He really believed he was abducted into underground torture chambers. Over time, psychologists pointed out that the blue people in the darkness were probably hallucinations caused by paranoid schizophrenia. Back then, the general public was afraid and even disgusted by the diagnosis, so the Amazing Stories magazine stopped printing any more of Shaver's stories. Shaver sought help at a hospital, but the medical field wasn't equipped to handle his condition back then. He spent the rest of his days arguing about finding books made of stone, as his works became more violent and disparaging. But in spite of Shaver's downfall, his blue people story still attracts people to Blowing Cave to this very day. Others couldn't care less about tales of subterranean torturers, but the two groups of visitors are unified by a sense of discovery. Believers and non-believers come to Blowing Cave for the thrill of adventure. Cavers can map new routes that no human has ever seen before, and that's the same type of thrill that the Shaver mystery inspired in people, including 3 young adults back in 2016. 25-year-old Casey Sherwood was in his senior year at Arkansas State University when he met 2 freshman exchange students from Japan. Daisuke Tagagi and Daiki Aito were both exchange students eager to explore Blowing Cave. Japan has a vibrant caving community, with multiple nationwide groups and many smaller teams spread across its multiple islands. The group made preparations for their trip. Sometimes adventurous people like them get the itch to go caving. They might research some gear and maybe a few tips and tricks, but many explorers want to strike while the iron is hot. They don't want to save up money to get fully suited in professional caving gear. Driven by impulse, they grab what they can and descend into darkness. For college students in the US, it could be hard to afford milk and sandwiches, let alone quality gear for hobbies. But this isn't any old hobby. Caving gear can be single-handedly responsible for your death or your survival. The 3 grabbed headlamps and athletic backpacks, and they thought these tools would be the only gear they needed. They weren't totally wrong. These basic tools could get them about a mile into the cave. That's a good distance for any beginner, but past that point, Blowing Cave gets serious. Dressed in regular clothes, the three-man team drove down a narrow dirt road through the Arkansas wilderness. Eventually, they reached a few parking spots. From there, they hiked roughly a quarter mile along a trail, past a beat-up portable outhouse and chairs that faced a fast-flowing, shallow stream of water that barreled across the rocks. Blowing Cave's entrance is a dome-shaped hole in a rock face towering above the ground. The ceiling is draped in moss as the roof curves down to a thin opening into the rest of the cave. The three were bogged down by thick mud just a few feet beyond the entrance. The cave has high moisture content and lots of silt and mud, which could easily cause cavers to slip and fall or get stuck crawling through its winding tunnels. The mud would slow the team down, but they kept trudging through the sludge. Eventually, they reached the potato masher. This section was formed after a cave-in shattered the ceiling of a larger room. After the rock fell, smaller tunnels emerged through the crumbled boulders as new pathways were eroded over time. Beyond one of the branching paths, the walkway intersects a fast-flowing stream of water. Soon, they'd reached the source of the moisture within the cave, but they had to cross the stream first. Without proper ropes, they risked everything walking through the stream. One slip could take the whole party down. They made it past this challenge and reached another difficult section dubbed the meat grinder. Past this formation, they found the waterfall room. The source of the cave's water cascaded down the rock in a fast-flowing waterfall roughly twice the width of a human. Weighty stalactites hang from the ceiling, dripping down onto shallow pools of still blue water. As they were exploring Blowing Cave, they discovered the cave's old use as a den for parties never died. The cave was littered with graffiti, including some arrows showing the way, so they had an easy time navigating the tunnels. However, as they ventured deeper, the markings began to disappear. Fewer and fewer people had progressed this far, until eventually there were no more signatures or pictures, just muddied stone. On the way out, the markings popped up again, but not as constant as before. The exit path was taking a lot longer than it should have, and the passages weren't looking familiar. The whole way out, a thought had been creeping up in the back of Casey's mind, and now, with the walls bare and the twisting passages of craggy rock stretched out before them, he finally had to admit it. They were lost. Trying to keep a calm face to avoid panicking his friends, Casey gave them the bad news. They asked him what to do, and he made the call to stay still and wait. They all shared a moment of panic, but they agreed to the plan. Even though they were underprepared, Casey effectively had a fourth caver outside at his house, his wife Catherine. By nightfall, the trio hadn't contacted her yet. She sat waiting nervously. As the night grew later, she had to admit to herself the same grim reality Casey was struggling with, except she didn't know if they were even still alive. She finally picked up the phone and called emergency services. The Arkansas University Police Department contacted the county sheriff and firefighters, who also got in touch with volunteer rescue cavers. Groups of rescuers made it to the cave around 2 a.m. Expert cavers from nearby colleges also pitched in to help locate the missing students. Meanwhile, in the cold, rocky tunnels of the cave, Casey, Daisuke, and Daiki formed a plan. While the young men executed their plan, the rescue operation began. Teams began exploring designated routes inside the cave with extra lights, some first aid gear, and communication tools. They were tasked with getting intelligence on what might have happened so rescuers could figure out what to do next. These teams kept exploring as more rescuers arrived, but they couldn't turn up any details. It really looked like the 3 college students had vanished. More people fanned out along the cave's tunnels to sweep for any signs of the lost cavers. Time kept ticking away. Back home, Catherine might have been losing it with fear, sobbing as rescuers told her the grim odds her husband faced. Minutes turned to hours, and eventually rescuers noted that the 3 had been missing for over a day. They said when people have been missing for over 24 hours, it's unlikely they'll be found alive. Catherine knew they weren't pro-cavers. They didn't have top-quality gear, experience, or even enough food and other supplies. The rescue mission was turning into a search for their bodies. Inside the cave, the group went into survival mode. They sat in a triangle with their backs together for warmth. They also tried to pull their arms inside their shirts, not knowing that strategy could have made their situation worse. The mud started to get cold, sapping their body heat. Dirt and soil easily releases heat into the air. That's why survivalists use leaves to create a barrier against the ground. Mud isn't like clothing that's designed to hold on to heat, but since they decided to stay put, they couldn't reach the water. Even if they did, as nightfall brought colder temperatures, the water could have accelerated hypothermia. To offset the heat loss from the mud, they pulled their shirts over their heads to trap their breath in their shirts. That was a smart move to stay warm. But in a cave, that technique could also be deadly. Some caves have very poor airflow. Stagnant air causes carbon dioxide levels to rise as people exhale. These pockets of foul air can linger in caves for a long time and trap unsuspecting cavers. Carbon dioxide is colorless and odorless, and usually people don't realize they're experiencing CO2 poisoning until it's too late. They would get headaches, their breath would get faster, and eventually they'd pass out. With their shirts over their heads, they'd be getting even less oxygen than normal. Their muddy shirts could act like cement bags over their heads, suffocating them to death. A member of the Arkansas Grotto caving group, Landon Downing, was there helping rescuers, and he reminded them that even though Blowing Cave was well mapped, there could still be miles of unexplored passageways. Caves are ever-changing, and even the best cavers can miss new connections. After all, exploring the unknown is what drives many cavers in the first place. New waves of rescuers were tasked with looking for new or obscure pathways that the team could have taken. Shortly after re-entering the cave with this new directive, the rescue team heard something. Overnight, the trio created another simple plan. Roughly every 10 minutes, they would whistle or yell the phrase, "Help, going out!" The rescue team had heard a distant sound unlike the water noises or eerie silence of the cave. With their expert knowledge of the cave, they knew what directions the sounds were coming from. At this point, the rescuers still didn't know if they were injured or separated, but at least one of them was alive. The rescuers ducked around a few more corners, shouting back, and soon they located all 3 of the missing students. The teams of rescuers had given up hope of finding them alive. They looked on in shock as the 3 scholars, drenched in mud, walked out of the cave alive. They were all alive, and they looked unharmed. Of course, not all damage is visible on the outside. The 3 were treated for minor cases of hypothermia from sitting in the ice box of the Blowing Cave for over 30 hours. Outside, Takagi and Aito posed for an unsettling photo with the local news crew. They both did the Arkansas State wolves up hand gesture. Aito looks strangely unfazed by his brush with death, but Takagi looks like he's in shock, which makes the hand gesture feel forced. An unnatural response by someone reeling from a harrowing experience. The rescuers gave interviews reminding people not to trust a cave just because it's been mapped. There could always be new twists and turns hidden in the shadows. They recommend anyone new to a cave, be they beginners or veterans, talk to local cavers and get a first-hand tour first before exploring. The county sheriff's office was blindsided by the rescue, so they asked the Arkansas Grotto Club to work with them on a shared disaster plan. They hope they never have to call on each other again, but if they do, they want to be ready. Arkansas State University's chancellor, Lenita Cooksey, thanked the rescue teams and the community for their support in rescuing their students. It turns out the trio were only 30 minutes away from the entrance. They were so close, yet it took rescuers over a day to find them. That illustrates the monumental task rescuers face as they flip on their lamps and march into the abyss. It also shows how dangerous caves can truly be. It doesn't matter if you're a mile into a cave, hundreds of feet below ground, stuck upside down, or just a few inches from safety, you're always one wrong move away from being claimed by the abyss. Hubbard's Cave in Colorado was home to one of the most bizarre cave rescues of all time. 2 families pleaded for help after 2 adults disappeared without a trace. Law enforcement made the unprecedented move to block rescuers from entering Hubbard's Cave for days. Later, rescuers were allowed inside, and then a fight erupted after the rescue, which sparked another investigation. The families accused the police with failing to comply with procedures, and the investigators claimed the lost cavers staged their own disappearance. Did rescuers make it in time to save the 2 lost cavers? Which side was right? Join us as we uncover the mysteries of the Hubbard's Cave rescue. Hubbard's Cave was named after settler William Hubbert when he and his brother-in-law Griff Jones uncovered the cave during their journey for gold in 1892. Originally, they only found a pile of boulders, but as they broke them apart, the tumbling rubble revealed a cave entrance. Hubbard and Jones searched for a better entrance, and they found an opening they could easily explore without laboring against tons of rock. Inside, the pair found campfires left by native Ute tribes. The Ute have a tradition known as the Bear Dance, which is a 10-day celebration held in March. In the past, they raced horses, gambled, and ate before and after the main event. In reverence to the bears they hunted, the Ute people gathered to dance like a bear scratching a tree, while musicians played instruments called rasps or notched sticks that mimic the sound of claws on bark. Afterward, the designated storyteller would weave interesting and allegorical tales around a campfire. Hubbert and Jones even noted that there was evidence of bears living in the cave as well. The prospectors were enchanted by the cave. They kept walking deeper as each new step revealed new cave formations and crystals they had never seen before. Eventually, they realized they were lost. In their panic, they wound their way through the labyrinth of the cave, which only worsened their situation. They nearly resigned to their fate when their hunting dog trotted into their lamplight and led them back to the surface. Today, Hubbert's Cave is located on the edge of the Glenwood Canyon on a rolling, rocky hillside dotted with pine trees overlooking the Colorado River. Another entrance was later found, giving the cave 3 different paths, and Hubbert's houses one of the largest bat populations in Colorado. For over a century since its rediscovery, Hubbert's remained open to the public, and it was a popular attraction for cavers, hikers, and partiers. Back in 2003, 54-year-old John Hayter and 49-year-old Sherry DeCrow drove into the Colorado wilderness to start their expedition into the countryside. They stopped at a trailhead parking space and started again down a long trail meant for bicycles and ATVs, though some brave hikers choose to walk the whole 9-mile trail along this route just to reach the actual trail that leads to Hubbert's. The long trail leads to a secretive quarter-mile trail marked by an outdated and unkempt sign. The last stretch is steep and rocky, which makes the journey even more challenging. John and Sherry were fit, but the hike drained them more than they realized. Their fatigue would come back to bite them, limiting their mobility and strength in the cave and causing them to make poor choices that led to disaster. The main entrance to Hubbert's is a triangular hole in the streaked rock that protrudes from the ground. The floor of the entrance is lined with sharp, jagged stones that have splinted from the cliffside or the ceilings of the cave. The ceiling dips down to resemble a dark, gaping maw ready to devour all those who dare to enter. Sherry only planned to show John the way to Hubbert's Cave, but once they reached the cold and curious void in the rock, they threw caution to the wind and ventured into the darkness. Just like Hubbert and Jones before them, the ambitious pair entered the cave, oblivious to the dangers that lay in wait below them. After their long trek, they had an easy start to the cave. Over the years, the government installed some steps, a metal tube, a support wall, and a ladder at the entrance because so many non-cavers ventured to the site. John and Sherry fit among those casual cavers who don't take splunking seriously. They brought flashlights instead of headlamps. They had no backup lights. They wore regular athletic hiking gear, and they had no food or water. On top of all these mistakes, they then started their journey by ignoring one of the most important steps for any cave adventure. They didn't tell anyone they were going into Hubbert's Cave. Communicating the plan to others is a crucial step for anyone who wants to explore the deep tunnels below our feet. Once inside a cave, cell phones won't work. If you get stuck, injured, or lost, you're stuck relying on a chance encounter with another cave group, or you're dead. John and Sherry overestimated their abilities and thought that Hubbert's would be safe, since it was such a popular attraction. Venturing into the cave, they found the same formations that bewildered William Hubbert when he explored the cave. There were selenite needles that jabbed from the walls like strands of glass, cave hair formed by gypsum oozing out of small pores in the rock to make curly hairs or long strands of silky-looking rope, and they found many more otherworldly sights as they hiked deeper below. The pair twisted around the bends of the cave without realizing Hubbert's contains 3 major passages. Nearly 400 feet into the cave, they noticed one of their lights was flickering. They shook the flashlight and jostled the electronics around a bit like you would with an old remote. Maybe the batteries were dislodged, or there was something stuck in the contacts that jammed up the electrical current. The device looked fine, but it was pretty old. Most people have flashlights for convenience, not for emergencies. Flashlights are rarely replaced, and few people fork out the money for a quality device. One of them realized how old the flashlight was after noticing the once clear plastic was slightly yellow from sunlight exposure. Then, the flashlight completely turned off. For once on this unfortunate adventure, they made the right call and turned around to go back to the safety of the forest above. As they walked through the narrow archways and over slippery ground, the other would-be caver nervously laughed and mentioned their flashlight was also old. They said they'd buy a new one later and offered to go shopping together. But roughly halfway back, they realized their light was dimming. Then, a familiar sight made their hearts sink and their stomachs turn. Their last remaining torch began to flicker. With one last flare, their only remaining light source was extinguished. Once more, they made a sound decision to remain stationary and pray for help. When Sherry didn't return home that night, no one seemed to notice. She was an adult, and she could come and go as she pleased. But 2 days after the pair went missing, her family, the DeCrows, tried to contact her. They only got her voicemail. They tried her home, but she wasn't there either. Sherry's daughter, Ramia, convened with the rest of the family to discuss her mother's absence. Some thought she might have skipped town to marry her friend John, but others were afraid something terrible had happened to her. That night, they submitted a missing persons report to the Garfield County Sheriff's Department. Now, some members of her family thought her ex-husband could be to blame, so the police investigated him. The family suggested her ex was violent, and fear quickly spread about what he could have done to her. Of course, her ex-husband was a dead end, and he had alibis for the night of her disappearance. Knowing that Sherry would sometimes explore the outdoors, the Air National Guard ran a helicopter sweep of the river and other water sources to search for her body. This search turned up no results, and it also failed to find their vehicle, which was still parked at the trailhead. That's when the DeCrows started to butt heads with the police. They thought the investigators didn't do a thorough job, so they recruited a family friend to fly his personal plane in search for any signs of Sherry. After only 30 minutes in the air, this independent pilot found her Suburban parked at the trail in the Colorado wilderness. This spot and its connection to Hubbard's has been popular for over 100 years. The family immediately knew what happened, but they couldn't convince the police. In their eyes, deputies and others involved in the search should have immediately connected the dots that Sherry could have been inside Hubbard's cave. But instead of calling a rescue team, they taped off the parking lot as a possible crime scene. After far too long, days after Sherry and John got lost, a canine unit led police to Hubbard's cave. Reports suggest that the police had no idea how to proceed. They called for Sherry down the cold stone steps of the cave and shined their lights into the darkness, but they didn't venture inside. To make matters worse, they still didn't call a cave rescue team. Sherry's son and daughter said they would search the cave themselves and recruit cavers to guide them to find their mother. The chances of finding her alive continued to plummet every second. They knew she was inside and they needed to act immediately, but the police refused to grant entry into Hubbard's because of the already debunked fears about her ex and the possibility of foul play which could endanger the lives of anyone entering the cave. Since it was considered a crime scene, they wouldn't allow anyone to potentially tamper with evidence, even though they could have escorted the rescuers to ensure they complied with procedures. The two camps argued until a thunderstorm rolled over the mountains and valleys of the area and the police disbanded the search party. Inside the cave, John and Sherry were struggling. The cold was numbing their rattling fingers and the darkness was messing with their heads. At first, they thought about what they would do when they got out, But by the third day, they were crushed by hopelessness. Temperatures in Hubbert's cave dropped to as low as 3 degrees above freezing. Then, as the storm came through, rain started to trickle down overhead and little streams snaked over their shoes. They didn't see the water coming in the absolute darkness of the cave, and now they had to face the cold with wet clothes. But at least these muddy drops of water could keep them alive, for now. Like her family, Sherry even wondered if her vindictive husband could be to blame for their misfortune. John also had an angry ex. Did their divorced partners collude to sabotage their batteries on purpose? The thought struck fear into them. What if their exes were waiting outside? And what were they planning to do with them? Beyond fear and the cold, the pair also faced other challenges inside the tunnels. Hubbert's cave is at an elevation of 8,400 feet. Outside, the air is thinner and oxygen content is lower. It takes travelers days or weeks to adjust to the dry and thin atmosphere. They were used to it, but the body can only handle so much, and the oxygen inside the cave was even lower. They sat stationary, sucking all the fresh air from their surroundings. On top of all their other problems, the pair was slowly being poisoned by their own stagnant breath. By day 4, John was in bad shape. The two couldn't see how ragged they looked in the pitch blackness of the cave, but John's starvation and slow asphyxiation were becoming unbearable. If help didn't arrive soon, Hubbert's cave would become John's tomb. The thunderstorm battered the land for what felt like an eternity. The whole time, the DeCrows battled against the police to return and perform a rescue operation. Finally, after 4.5 days of Sherry's disappearance, police let the family and their team enter the cave. Of course, the police, who delayed the rescue for almost a week, sat outside. Even as the police watched people who had no idea how to properly explore caves enter the dark reaches of Hubbert's, they still didn't call an official rescue squad to aid them. The brave DeCrows weren't official rescuers. They had no gear. They lacked all the training cave rescuers dedicate their lives to learning and perfecting. But that day, they became rescuers. Armed with only crude flashlights and determination to find their missing family members, the team located Sherry and John only minutes after entering the cave. Because the group found Sherry so easily after entering the cave, that proved to the DeCrows that the police didn't even try to find her. After being gaslit for almost a week, the tension escalated into a fight between the police and the DeCrows. Allegedly, a detective choked one of the volunteers who joined the DeCrows to find the lost cavers. People on both sides held back the more aggressive members of each group, and eventually the threat of charges simmered the upset family members while John and Sherry were evaluated by medics. They were both exhausted and dehydrated. Their families explained the situation from their perspectives, which disgusted the fearful and shivering cavers. The medics noted they were weak and dehydrated, but they gave Sherry and John the choice to get hospitalized or return home. After seeing the fervor of their families, they opted to go home with them instead of traveling with emergency personnel. Home was a long way off, so the group stopped at a hotel to recover from the harrowing incident. It was later revealed that the sheriff never alerted local media outlets about Sherry's disappearance. The sheriff denied the cave rescue because he thought it could be a crime scene. But if that's the case, then why did he ignore a major component of a missing persons case? If he had given the public info on her car, it's likely that cavers or hikers would have found her Suburban the very next day after they went missing. The allegations of a detective choking a volunteer rescue were investigated by the Colorado Bureau of Investigations, and word spread throughout the nearby towns. Further adding fuel to the fire, the police insinuated that John and Sherry staged their rescue, despite the visible and medical evidence that they were battered and succumbing to exposure. The sheriff based his claim off of the inconclusive missing persons search, which involved members of the FBI. Sources indicate the team never properly explored the cave, which invalidates the validity of the search. His claim also relies on the medical evaluation that said the pair were fine, but the evidence seems to suggest the sheriff simply misunderstood the medic's evaluation. The medics have an obligation to prevent medical deterioration, but if John and Sherry got fluids, food, and rest, they should be fine. After seeing the tension between both groups, the medics could have made the call out of pity for Sherry and John. If they were sent to the hospital, they would be subjected to interviews from the police, which would only make them more upset. However, on the other hand, if Sherry and John got worse after leaving, the medics would be responsible for their condition. The medics would also be putting their necks on the line to lie to police. But from the reports, it seems like that the cavers and the police could have made mistakes, so it's also possible the medics dropped the ball as well. And in what seems like one final admission of incompetence, the sheriff said he knew the contact information of multiple Colorado cave rescue teams and the procedures for cave rescues, but in spite of the dogs leading them straight to Hubbard's, the sheriff claimed that he had, and I'm quoting, "no reason to presume John and Sherry were lost in a cave," end quote. The sheriff also said he still believed in his method and that he'd do it the same way again. Both the cavers and the sheriff highlight how ignorance can easily become the death of anyone daring to explore underground caves. If John and Sherry knew the dangers and prepared accordingly, they probably would have been fine. And if the sheriff really understood cave rescues, his decisions could have been different, and the pair could have been saved much faster. But, as the DeCrows and the volunteers showed, you don't have to be a professional to be a hero when it counts. Little Brush Creek Cave is Utah's deepest cave, stretching 6 miles long with a maximum depth of 658 feet. It can only be safely explored in the winter when the water outside is frozen, and the cave's cold interior challenges even the toughest cavers. In 2018, a group of 4 adults met in a rehab clinic. The facility encouraged them to stick together as a group to hold each other accountable and avoid relapse. Together, they embarked on adventures in the wilderness far from the stress and temptations of city life. So far, they had only hiked, but they wanted something more hands-on, something more exciting. They had never gone caving before in their lives, but the name Little Brush Creek sounded harmless. Little did they know, they would soon find themselves in a fight for their lives, trapped in the darkness. Little Brush Creek Cave is located in the Uinta Mountains of Utah at an elevation of 8,000 feet. At those heights, the thin air strains the body of any would-be explorers, wearing out even the strongest athletes. And if people aren't acclimated to the low oxygen content, they could get lightheaded or even faint during outdoor adventures. The top of the Uinta Mountains are composed of non-porous rock, but over time, small cracks allowed water to flow into the soft limestone beneath, which formed a network of tunnels below ground. These conditions create what's known as allogenic caves, and they contain unique formations thanks to the different chemical makeup of the waters that flow within them. The group of 4 young adults, 3 men and 1 woman in their early 20s, were getting stir-crazy in California. The winter months limited their access to the outdoor activities they were using to recover in rehab. That's when they learned about Little Brush Creek Cave from YouTube videos and online blogs. Springtime melt floods the cave, turning it from a dangerous cave into a deadly one. They realized it was the perfect time to explore the cave, which was just 2 states over in Utah. The friends followed an outback trail through the snowy mountains to a clearing that doubles as a parking area. From there, they walked through the deep, powdery snow to a steep hill that meets the side of the Uinta Mountains. Rainwater and melting snow pooled along the wall where the slope meets the rock, forming a large, bell-shaped hole that became the cave's entrance. They climbed down the nearly vertical drop that levels out before the cave. They entered Little Brush Creek Cave around midday. Inside the entrance, crystal-clear icicles mirror the stalactites deeper within, and Large, frosty stalagmites catch the light from headlamps to create a neon blue glow. Deeper within, the cave's unique ice structures can reach over 10 feet long. The rocky floor of the entrance allows only around 100 feet of sunlight inside before the cool depths snuff out what little heat the wintry sun provided. Just beyond the shadows, the cavers encountered dozens of stripped and shaped trees that slid down after a logging operation accident that occurred roughly 20 years ago. The accident also sent more rubble into the cave, pinching the first tunnel past the entrance. Little Brush Creek Cave's entry is easy to navigate even for first-time cavers, but the logs do present some unique challenges. The rocky foundation underneath the logs could cause them to dislodge and roll if people disturb them too much. Thin pieces of timber can break apart, splintering and stabbing cavers through their clothing, and other breaks can send wood catapulting toward other cavers. So, watch your step. Past this section, there are multiple paths cavers can take. There's a small tube called the Bobcat Crawl that takes cavers from one side of the mountain to the other, but it's just a straight shot. The group could have trained with this tunnel first, but they wanted the real cave experience. Deeper in, where the rubble ends and the smooth, rocky floor of the cave begins, the cave twists into a curvy slide. Ropes are anchored to the wall, so splunkers can clip and hold onto it for stability as they venture down this steep section. At the bottom, most cavers will encounter Little Brush Creek's first water section, dubbed the Corner Pool and the Glowing Stream. Adventurers must steel their courage and jump into the frigid water as the cold instantly shocks their system, tightening their legs and forcing their lungs to the point of near hyperventilation. The 4 new cavers plan to go through the atrium past the waters, the shower room, the pillar and balcony room, and the black rock room, where the smooth yellowed stone is splintered with regions of shiny black onyx. The group also found a gate with frosty, feather-like crystals growing down from the ceiling and over-rusted metal bars. This area is sometimes called Toothbrush Cave, named for those unique crystals at the entrance. Their research didn't warn them about the vertical passages deep within the cave. These sections of the cave contain vertical pits that are much more dangerous than the main route. Vertical caving can be one of the most dangerous parts of the hobby, as one slip can mean certain death. One of the cave's most daunting sections is a bolted crack that combines vertical caving with another dangerous element, the squeeze. This whole crack is very narrow, and cavers have to traverse it without proper vision of what lies below. Cracks and climbs like these should only be attempted by elite cavers. The team slowly marched forward. 20 to 30 feet past their chosen entrance, Little Brush Creek Cave quickly changes into a slide, formed from a cave-in that brings cavers to a massive 40-foot drop called the Funnel Pit. They weren't far into the cave at this point, but instead of turning around, they made the bold move to climb down the pit. Unfortunately, in their rush to adventure, they skipped all the important details that new cavers must learn about. They were woefully unprepared. They only had one small headlamp each, and they had no knee pads, helmets, or batteries. To make matters worse, they were dressed in basic attire, with cotton shirts and regular pants. They were already feeling the consequences of their mistakes just a few hundred feet into the cave. Inside the cave, temperatures average in the 30s, just a few degrees above freezing. Maybe their choice to avoid the main route was a blessing in disguise. If they had traveled the main route, well, they'd likely be frozen before any rescuers could arrive. The 3 shuffled down the funnel, and somehow managed to climb down a 40-foot wall. They caught their breath on the next ledge. They only had 2 directions. They could go back up, or try to climb down another roughly 80 to 150-foot cliff. Most of them were already exhausted, but one man was bold enough to attempt the climb without ropes or proper gear. His family called him fearless, and in this moment he proved his mettle. beginning his descent into the darkness without hesitation. He slowly felt around for each foothold and lowered himself down one section at a time. Eventually, he was almost invisible as the light from the other cavers struggled to reach him. They had no idea how far down he was when the elements got to him. He wasn't equipped to deal with the cave's chilly temperatures. He had no extra layers of clothing and no gloves or adequate shoes. The cold made his fingers struggle to hold onto the smooth stone, and his shoes couldn't get enough traction to grip. The newbie caver managed to climb a respectable distance, despite handicapping himself without the proper gear, but unfortunately he lacked one more vital piece of caving equipment: a harness. A harness would allow him some leeway if he made a mistake, and if he got stuck, well, his friends might be able to pull him to safety. With a harness, he might be able to catch himself, stabilize, and begin to rappel or climb down again. But without a harness, he had no chance. The caver took one more step and slipped, plummeting into the darkness below. Some accounts say that the pit he was climbing was roughly 80 feet deep. Others report it was at least 150 feet, which means he fell anywhere from 40 to 100 feet down. He let out a quick cry as he fell. The sound of his flesh bouncing off the cold floor echoed through the pit, followed by his screams of agony. His friends were horrified by his shouts. They stood, trembling, unable to will themselves to climb down and attempt first aid. They tried to turn around and climb back up the first shaft, but the cold and their fear made their knees weak and their hands shake. The 3 remaining cavers couldn't climb out for help. They were all stuck in Little Brush Creek Cave, and one of them was dying. Hours passed by while the 3 remaining cavers struggled with their thoughts as their bodies were assailed by the bitter cold, and their injured friend continued to wail in the darkness below. As they sat shivering on the dark ledge, another ghastly thought crept into their minds. They never told anyone they were going caving. They broke the first rule of caving, and now they had to get lucky or die. This grim realization ignited the adrenaline in one of the cavers, and he forced himself to start the climb back up the first 40-foot shaft. His arms trembled at first, but as he made progress, his movements got smoother. The terror dulled the pain of his dry, cracked skin, the sting of the air, and the burn of his muscles. For a while, he paid no attention to the rapid pulse banging in his chest until fatigue set in. The rubbery feeling was gone, but now the cold combined with lactic acid in his muscles to stiffen them as if he was wearing casts on his arms and legs. Each time he reached for a handhold, he winced in pain. Each time he pushed up with his feet, he felt the sting through his quads. All the while, his friend writhed in pain, howling through the cave. With luck on his side, the brave explorer reached onto the ledge of the funnel room and pulled with all his remaining strength. He made it up the cliff, scrambled through the rocky incline, and ducked under the metal gate wreathed in crystals. He stared at his phone. No reception. He dashed out of the rubble-filled mouth of the cave and stumbled onto the snow, leaving blood-tinged handprints from the cracks along his knuckles. He stared in dismay. There was still no reception. He scrambled up the snowy banks and ran as fast as he could, with each step sinking his legs deep into the snow. Once he reached the clearing by the car, he had enough distance from the massive Uinta Mountains to make the call. But the group's torment was far from over. The people on the other line struggled to understand him as he panted for breath. His sinuses went into overdrive, filling his nose and throat with mucus to protect the delicate tissues of his throat and lungs from the bitter winter air. It made his voice even harder to hear. Once the message got through to the operator, he had more bad news to deal with. The department who received the call had no experience with cave rescues. They would send over any police or firefighters they could spare, but everyone would have to wait for specialists to arrive before they could begin the rescue. Dispatch contacted the National Cave Rescue Commission's Rocky Mountain region, which utilized their call-out service to send the distress signal to any available volunteer rescuers. Multiple on-call volunteers heard the message and agreed to venture to Little Brush Creek Cave, but it would take them nearly 12 hours to reach the parking lot deep in the wilderness. All the while, the injured caver was battling for survival. Once rescuers arrived, they quickly made it to the first ledge, and then down to the injured caver. This section had ropes and anchors, so the properly equipped experts rappelled down in record speed. Once by the patient's side, rescuers saw the damage he had sustained. The fallen caver had numerous severe injuries. It was a miracle he was still alive. His ankle was broken, his pelvis cracked, both wrists were shattered, both elbows were also broken, and as his head ricocheted off the stone floor, the impact also broke his cheekbone, his eye socket, and his jaw. On top of these horrifying injuries, his limbs were turning blue from frostbite. As medics assessed the injured caver, other rescuers helped the remaining man and woman into harnesses. Then, they slowly helped the shivering cavers up the funnel pit. Once up top, they were given extra layers and assessed for any injuries. They weren't in any serious trouble, so they were given the option to wait for their friend or go to the hospital. Down below, the injured caver was faced with an intensely stressful situation. Reports didn't indicate what he and his friends were overcoming in rehab, but the U.S. is still gripped by an opioid epidemic, so it's likely he could have had troubles with pills. If the injured caver was recovering from an addiction to these substances, he would have been faced with a terrible dilemma. His pain was unreal, so medics would likely offer strong painkillers like morphine to make the extraction easier for all parties. But any painkillers could rekindle an addiction. Because of the injuries sustained by the fallen caver, a regular stretcher wouldn't be enough to get him out safely. Instead, they used a litter, which had the same rugged material as a normal stretcher, but with an added basket supporting structure around the outside. This structure provided an extra layer of protection for the patient, and the rigidity of the tubes helped maintain the patient's posture. To help even more, litters like these can also include a spine board, a neck brace, and multiple straps. The Little Brush Creek Cave rescue utilized a Stokes basket model, which was transferred to the rescue site in pieces and reassembled at the extraction point, so rescuers didn't have to carry a bulky and awkward device down the dangerous vertical drops. The model rescuers used was also painted orange, so it would immediately stand out in the light of their headlamps. There was no chance of losing sight of the patient once the operation began. The only downside with this model was the cold. The metal and plastic of the rigid structure could easily become cold enough to cause damage to any exposed skin. But the rescuers solved that problem by wrapping the patient in a thermal blanket, and anyone handling the basket used thick gloves to block the cold. Thankfully, the accident occurred close to the entrance, and there weren't many obstacles for rescuers to overcome. Rescuers could have used the original anchors to save the man and woman trapped on the first ledge, but the injured caver was at the bottom of the second pit. To get him up safely, rescuers had to reinforce a pulley system to reduce the force needed to pull the injured caver up the cliff. That's standard procedure, but the shape of the tunnels challenged the rescuers. The rope had to snake through an L-shaped hole with sharp angles at the top and bottom, followed by a long stretch and then another shaft. It took a few hours to complete, but once the line was in place, rescuers secured the Stokes litter to the rope with tough straps and began hauling the patient up the cave. At one point, they had to stand him up to fit through a narrow crack, but the rescuers helped him through the pain by distracting him with conversation. They asked which actor he'd want to cover him if his rescue ever turned into a movie deal. At 10 a.m., nearly 15 hours after the miraculous distress call reached the dispatch, the injured patient was finally brought to the surface. Rescuers already set up another simple rope system to get the stretcher up the remaining snow-covered slopes, and once they overcame that final obstacle, the patient was safely secured in an ambulance. Further down the road, a medical evacuation helicopter found a safe clearing to land. The two teams rendezvoused at the clearing just beyond the trees, and the man was flown to a hospital in Salt Lake City for emergency treatment. He was in critical condition for a while, which put his friends and loved ones on edge as they prayed for his recovery. Ultimately, he praised the efforts of Salt Lake City Fire Captains David Dixon and Stave Crandall for their heroic and selfless efforts. The injured caver's family started a GoFundMe to help cover the cost of his treatment, and cavers from all over the world joined together to raise nearly $8,000 for the injured explorer. The group of 4 newbie cavers had respectable rehab goals, but their story is a reminder that caves don't care about the lives of those who venture inside. Caves will claim lives instantly and without remorse, so always be prepared if you dare to venture deep below ground. Would you be the brave caver who risked it all to climb out of Little Brush Creek Cave to save his friends? Or would the cold and fear leave you stranded like the rest of them? Tell us how you'd react on that dark ledge in the comments section below. And while you're there, shine some light on that like button and secure your own ropes with a subscription to the channel so that you don't miss the next mind-blowing video.